Hey everyone, this is Vanessa Chase Lockshin from the Storytelling Nonprofit. We're going to get started here with our monthly hangout in just a few minutes. I'm sure a couple of you are still joining, so we'll go ahead and wait just a few minutes here to get started. I'm pretty excited about this month's topic. We're going to be talking about engaging board members in storytelling, which is a great way to kind of ease them into the idea of fundraising. So we'll talk about what that looks like. I'm going to share a few tips, and as always, we'll leave some time for questions and answers towards the end of our hangout. So we should probably go here for about 45 minutes, maybe an hour. Probably depend on how many questions come through. Okay, so let me just fiddle here with my settings, and we'll get started here momentarily. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned, my name is Vanessa Chase Lockshin, and I'm with the StorytellingNonprofit.com, which is a consulting company. We specialize in helping nonprofit organizations tell their stories to raise more money. And I absolutely love doing the work I do. It's fantastic. I've been doing it for a couple of years now, and it's always a joy for me to get to work with fundraisers who are really passionate about their organizations and who are doing great work in the world. Really learn how to tell a good story so that they can engage their donors a bit more. And today's topic for our monthly hangout is kind of related to that. We're going to talk a little bit more about actually engaging board members in that process as well. So if you're new to our hangout series, I'll tell you a little bit about them. So last month I hosted our first monthly lunchtime Google Hangout, which was pretty great. We talked about storytelling in general. I offered a few tips around telling better stories, and we did some Q&A, which was a lot of fun. So I decided to make this a monthly thing for the foreseeable future. It's really enjoyable to connect with all of you, to help you out however I can. It's one of the things that I value most about the work I do is creating and cultivating community. And so today we're going to talk a little bit more about engaging your board members in fundraising and storytelling. So a bit of background to this topic. I see a few of you are still logging on, which is great. So welcome to those of you who are listening in. Before we get started too, also I'll just mention that if you have comments or questions as we go throughout the Hangout, feel free to leave them on the event page. You'll see there's a chat box on the front of the page. Just below the video, you can pop them in there and I will answer all of them as we go along. Also, if you want to join the live hangout when we get to the Q&A portion, if you want to jump on the video call with me, I'd love to have you. You can just let me know in the chat box and I will send you an invite to join the hangout. It'd be great to have a few more people on here besides just me talking. Okay, so back to what we're talking about today. So as I mentioned, we're talking about getting your board to tell your stories today, which I think is a great topic. So a little background to this topic. I think it was Leo from last month who suggested that this would be something he wanted to talk about. And I thought it was a great topic, so that's why we're touching on this month. I know a lot of you also share this concern of how do we get our board members engaged in this process? How do we get them more involved in fundraising? I think there's a couple of things that are really interesting to me about this topic. I mean, one, we always know that board members who are not professional fundraisers have fears about fundraising. I've seen it countless times on a lot of boards. And in general, I think there's a lot of taboo around talking about money. And so people get really nervous at the prospect of going out and asking other people for money for a cause. There's a lot of reasons why that happens. I feel like we could probably spend a whole session just talking about that. But I mean, one of them, of course, is fear of rejection. That's a big one. Fear of being perceived badly, things like that. So there's a lot of mental stigmas and also cultural stigmas that come with fundraising. And that's a lot of times what our board members are up against, especially since they are not professional fundraisers themselves. They're dealing with a lot of this, and it can be kind of difficult for them to ease into it. I've been on a board here in Vancouver for 4 years now. I've been the chair for the last year, and it's been really interesting for me as a fundraiser to sit on a nonprofit board. I'd been a fundraiser for a number of years, but I'd never been a board member until about 4 years ago. And what's interesting to me about being on the other side of the conversation is that I think as fundraisers, we have a lot of I think they have a lot of preconceived notions about what it's like to be a board member, how boards operate, what their meetings are like, things like that. And so I think just from a pure career development perspective, this was one of the best things I've done for myself, was actually joining a board, so that as a fundraiser, I could have more compassion and empathy for the board members that I work with when I work in-house with organizations, because I've actually seen how boards function being a part of one. And that's really, I think, given me a different perspective on the topic, hopefully one I can kind of speak to today. I think in that situation and the board I'm on, one of the things that I've noticed, or noticed earlier on, I suppose, in that process when the board was getting ready to be more involved in fundraising, was that there were a lot of mismatched expectations between board members and the staff. And this is something I see at a lot of organizations, where they're excited to get board members involved in fundraising, yet there's been kind of no laid out expectations as to what the organization expects board members to do. And so one of the kind of basic things we can do to hopefully eliminate that problem is actually create a job description for our board members. This is a really simple thing you can do today or even this week if it's not something you already have in place for your board members. And I highly recommend doing it just because as you onboard new people into your organization, and even for board members who've been around for a while, this is just a great way to say to them very clearly, you know, this is what we expect of people who are a part of our board. You know, here's those different expectations. And as you come to them with new projects or new initiatives, like helping on fundraising or helping get out in the community to network a bit more, you can say to them, you know, based on some of the things we've laid out in this job description, here's where I think this fits. So you can really be clear about the fact that you're not asking them to do anything outside of those expectations. It's merely a part of the duties and descriptions that you've written up for them. So that's something you can do, I think, that's just really basic and very helpful to kind of just get everyone on the same page. I've seen this a couple of times with organizations who are trying to get their board members involved in fundraising. They have a lot of challenges around this because they've had people who've been on the board for a couple of years who are used to things being a certain way, and then somebody starts to shake it up a little bit, and there's a lot of resistance because, you know, they've had certain expectations for so long and now they're being changed. And so it's kind of, I think it's kind of two-part. That aspect of change management is certainly important when you're kind of shifting gears with your board and getting them involved in a new way. So it's important to kind of take that into account and think about what that might look like for your board and for your organization. So that being said, I think once you kind of get that job description in place, there's certainly a lot of things we can do to ease board members into the process of fundraising. And I think telling stories is certainly one of the easier ways. What I've observed from my work with boards is that board members need a lot more compassion and guidance than we think they do. And so one of the things that I've seen is that, and I think especially when I first started working on the board and currently on, is that, you know, we would go to everybody at the monthly meeting and say, here's the project we want you to do. And I think, you know, I'll give you an example. Maybe it was like making 10 phone calls, thank you phone calls to donors. And we would give them some numbers, phone numbers for donors. We would give them a script and say, have at it, and then report back the next month. But what would often happen was that people would show up at the next meeting having not done that, or whatever activity we had asked them to do. And it was because we just were not providing enough support in between the meetings and enough accountability for the board members. And so I think when it comes to storytelling in particular, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later on, I think that what needs to happen is that we can't just say to our board members, we need you to start telling stories, here's what we need you to do, and have one conversation and that be the end of it. I think it's part of an ongoing dialogue that we have to keep engaging with over time. And so we kind of have to set ourselves up to continue to talk to board members about this, to continue to provide them with resources and support as we go along in that process. So that's just something to keep in mind. The other thing I just want to mention is that there are lots of models for thinking about how board members can be involved at a nonprofit. One that I particularly like and that I'll speak to today is Kay Sprinkle Grace's model. And she has 3 roles for board members. They all start with A's, which makes it a little easier to remember. So she says that board members can be askers. So they're out in front of donors asking for support. They can be advocates, so they're out in the community doing legal or political advocacy, things like that, which is certainly an important role, right? Especially if your organization is trying to do any significant social change work. That's a big role that we need them to be a part of. And the third role that she outlines for board members is that they are ambassadors. And this is a really interesting one because I think that this is maybe the gateway into getting our board members to be askers. First, we have them be ambassadors out in the community. And I think that this can take on a variety of manifestations where, you know, they could be at networking events, they could be speaking at public events on behalf of our organization, they could be networking with people, connecting potential donors with the ED or fundraising staff, things like that. So there's a lot of different roles of the ambassador, but I think that this is one of the more natural roles, of course, for them to be telling stories, which is a really great thing. So that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit more here. So I want to offer you a couple of tips around getting your ambassadors and also your askers to tell those stories more often. I have 4 specifically that we'll talk about. And then I would welcome all of you to shoot over your questions, and we'll do some Q&A about some specific scenarios that you may have or questions you have about getting your board members involved in this process. All right, so yeah, let's talk about the first one here. So if you have board members who are nervous about fundraising, one of the important things that I think to start with is to reframe the conversation about fundraising for them. And my friend and colleague, Claire Axelrad, does this brilliantly. I'm sure she has a lot of resources on her blog, which is clarification.com. She often talks about the fact that we need to reframe it for our board members as philanthropy, not fundraising, which I think is genius. It's so important. It's really, I mean, we really need to highlight for our board members that philanthropy is about so much more than just asking for gifts. It's about stewardship. It's about cultivation. It's about prospecting. It's about connecting people to something they might care about. It's kind of a matchmaking process, if you think about it, in particular with major gifts. So I think it's always important to highlight for board members that there's this kind of inspirational and emotional quality about fundraising and also philanthropy, that it's really about connecting people to something that they care deeply about so that they can make a difference in the community. And the more that we can reinforce that kind of narrative about fundraising for our board members, the more their perspective will start to change from it being this kind of negative, not so fun activity to something that they genuinely think is great and they're excited to be a part of for your organization. So that being said, I think that's always a good place to start. I've facilitated those conversations for a number of boards. It could be something like 10 minutes at the beginning of a board meeting. You could schedule a whole half hour or even a whole meeting to talk about that. But there is this kind of like basic education process that I think is really important to talk about. You know, how does your organization fundraise? What are the things you do? What's involved in that process, familiarizing your board with the types of people who give to your organization, and giving them some of that background can kind of make it a little less scary because they now understand the mechanics of how fundraising is happening. They know exactly what's going into it and how they might be able to be a part of that. So that's something I would just recommend starting with. As I mentioned earlier too, that idea of creating a job description is also really important. So those 2 things I think are kind of just the basics that are really important to set everyone up for success. So in terms of storytelling though, there's 3 things that I think are important. So first, I think you need to connect your board members really thoroughly to your organization's story. And so I think this often happens in the onboarding process, which is not something a lot of us put a lot of thought into. But if you do have a process for onboarding new board members, or if you do have new board members coming on, this is really important to do with them right from the start. So familiarizing them with you know, your organization's history, the type of work you do, the mission statement and the vision statement, all those things that really answer the questions, who are you, what do you do, and why is it important? You really want them to be able to speak to those 3 things. Those are really basic questions about your organization and kind of the overarching story that you want them to tell when they're out in the community talking to people. You want them to have kind of a small, concise elevator speech about, you know, what your organization is up to these days. So that's a really great thing to think about doing. I highly encourage you to do that. One of the ways you can kind of continuously keep people connected to that story is to just keep it a part of the active conversation at every board meeting. So you could do this by having a different staff member come to your board meeting and introduce, a story or a program that's happening, talk about what's going on. Again, connecting your board members to the work more directly. Just like we talk about connecting donors to the work more directly, it's, I think, pretty similar in a lot of ways. You could also have your executive director talk about stories. They're probably at the board meeting. That's a good opportunity for them to talk about it. One of the more powerful exercises that I've done with a board is having people, for the first 5 minutes or so, just reflect on what their own story is. So giving them some guided questions like, what brought you to our organization? What makes you want to be a board member? What difference are you hoping to make? And then having everybody go around the table and share that story, talk about why they're here and why they're there. And that can be a really good way just to build rapport between board members, which is certainly important, but also just help them realize some of the common threads that bring people to the table, and see kind of the similarities between themselves and other board members, and also realize that there are a lot of really interesting stories out there about your organization and the work that it's doing. So that kind of segues nicely into the next thing I want to talk about, which is connecting board members to their own personal story, which I think is a really important piece of the puzzle. So a lot of times board members will start and they've got a lot of enthusiasm for what's happening. They're really excited to be there. They're ready to go, which I think is wonderful. It's certainly an important thing to kind of capitalize on and make sure that you maintain that aspect over the tenure of their board membership. But I think one of the things that I always come back to is the question of why. Why are they there? Why are they doing the work they're doing? And why did they want to be a board member? I mean, it's such an interesting role. If you think about it in the hierarchy of nonprofit work, it's a senior leadership role. They're volunteers. They're really at the helm of the organization's leadership. What made them want to step into that role? So one of the things to think about asking them to do is to really be self-reflective in that process. So why do they care so much? Why did they feel like becoming a board member was the best way for them to make a difference? Do they have a personal connection to the cause? Is there something special about it that they want to talk about? And having them kind of think through why they're there is a really important thing to do, because that'll keep them connected and more passionate to the work. But I think the other thing they can also do is, when they're out in the community talking to people and they talk about, what they're up to, the fact that they volunteer, and somebody said, oh, tell me a little bit about that organization. They have already a concise, short little speech they can give about why they personally are excited about the work. And so they can kind of share this personal narrative and talk from a very personal and self-reflective perspective about that work, rather than just saying generic things about your organization, like its mission statement or what kind of programs you run, which are great things. But I think that for that conversation to be a little bit more engaging, they can use that personal story first. Or alternatively, they could always talk about a story they've heard or a story they've been told about some of the work or the people that your organization is helping, and they can then use that as kind of a part of their talking points, so to speak, when they're out talking to people about the organization and the work. So the last thing that I think is really important is, as I mentioned earlier, providing board members with ongoing support. So this is not something that you can just say to them once, we need you to tell stories, get on this, and then hope for the best. It really does have to be an ongoing thing. You have to provide them with new stories, support, and all that sort of, and all those sort of things. So one of the things that I would suggest doing is sending them a regular email update or a board update at their meetings, where you can actually share those stories with them. So give them some new stories to tell, inspire them with new stories about the work that's happening. And so that means that you actually have to be able to collect some of those stories to share, which I know can be challenging, but this is just all part of the ecosystem of making storytelling work. We have to have those stories to share. And the added benefit is, you'll be able to share those in your various social media channels or newsletters or whatever you're using to communicate with your donors. You'll also be able to give them to board members who can be conduits of that story as well. It's good to just check in with people also and say, have you told stories recently? How did it go? Where can I help you? Are there questions you're getting from people that you feel like you are not equipped to answer? And can I help you out with that? And so getting that feedback from them will really help you figure out where you can best support them and provide them with those direct resources. One of the things that I did with an organization, I think it was last year, was we developed a little like a business card size piece of paper as like cardstock. And what we did was once a quarter, we put new talking points on there and a short, like very short, I mean like 3 or 4 sentence story on the other side of it. And so board members had this in their wallet. So anytime they were out or if they needed just a refresher of what the talking points were for that quarter, they had that right on hand. And it was a really good resource for them. They always knew what they were supposed to be talking about. Maybe it was an upcoming event, maybe it was something new that was going on. And again, it was just a way that we were able to provide them with resources in a very simple and straightforward manner that helped empower them to carry out the work that we were asking them to do. So one of the things you could do, you could certainly do that. You could also ask them, you know, what sort of resources do you need from us to feel like you can take this on or carry on with what we're asking you to do? So those are some of my suggestions around getting board members to be more engaged in storytelling. And I also just thought of something else too is, you know, invite them to volunteer if that's at all possible with your organization so that they can firsthand have some stories to tell or experiences to share. That's a really great way for them to not only really understand the work in a different way, but again, be able to have stories or an experience to draw on when they're talking to donors or talking to their friends or family about the work that they're engaged with. So those are just a couple of tips that I wanted to provide you all with around getting your board involved in fundraising. And so I'm just going to pop over to our event page to see if there's any new questions. And if you have a question, I'd welcome you to share it or ask it over on the Google Plus event page. You can just type it in the chat box there. Also, if you'd like to join the live Hangout, you can do so by letting me know and I'll send you an invite to it. So I see Lee asked if I had a sample job description of a board member that I could share with us. I probably do somewhere. If you are looking for some sample ones, I would recommend checking out BoardSource. They're an organization in the US that's kind of dedicated to all things nonprofit boards. I feel like Charity Village probably also has some. Those would be my 2 recommendations of places to start if you are looking for just some board member job descriptions. So I hope that's helpful, Lee. Nice to see you on the Hangout. Okay, other questions? Give everyone a second or 2 to type those in. If you have specific questions around certain board members or things that are very situationally specific to your organization, you're also welcome to ask those as well. Happy to help you out with that. Try to give you some perspective on empowering board members in this process. One of the things that I think is actually really great about getting people to be self-reflective about their personal story and share that with the board is that I think it's actually a really powerful team building activity. One of the things that often happens with nonprofit boards is there can be turnover, there's new people, you know, and people aren't necessarily gelled fully as a team. So there's this process of becoming a better team together. And you need to kind of help facilitate that process for them, right? So you need to help them understand each other, understand how they can work together. And that can be kind of a challenging thing to do. But I think that by having them share their personal story about why they're involved with the board, that can be a really great way to start facilitating those connections and that interpersonal rapport, which can often be so important to being a part of the board itself and to having a really strong team that's a part of leading your organization and leading the charge forward. All right, so any other questions? Let's see here. I'm just going to pop over to the event page. Okay. Not yet. All right. So if there are any other questions, happy to answer them for you. You can just leave them on the Google Plus event page, and I'll go ahead and get those answered for you. If there's other resources you're looking for or things like that, also feel free to ask. Oh, great question, Jennifer. Okay, so Jennifer wants to know Where can she find out more information about the idea of askers, advocates, and ambassadors? Yeah, so I mentioned that briefly. I really like this model. There's a lot of different models about board members' roles in your organization. That one in particular comes from Kay Sprinkle Grace. She's written a lot of books on nonprofit management. I don't know if she has a website or not, but I'm sure that you could probably find her books at your local library or over on Amazon. Again, her name is Kay Sprinkle Grace. And she's written about that model of askers, advocates, and ambassadors, and talks about just how those three roles play together and how they also kind of cover the essential bases of engaging board members in kind of external community development work, which is often what we really need them to be doing. Certainly there's obviously governance as well. And so I wouldn't say that this is like all inclusive of every aspect of a board member's role, because the aspect of financial oversight, governance, things like that are certainly very important to their role on the board. But specific to community development, fundraising, external relations, that sort of thing, I think the way that she's categorized these three roles as asker, advocate, and ambassador are just really helpful to kind of conceptualize what it looks like for somebody to be involved in that. So I hope that's helpful, Jennifer. Yeah, so Rebecca says she likes the idea of sharing personal stories. We're struggling with our parents' board because many of them can't donate or don't feel comfortable asking. Yeah, that's a really good thing to note. So yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I think there's been a few boards that I've worked with in the last couple of years that have been boards where people who have joined, they've joined because they're genuinely excited about the organization. They want to be involved in it. And they don't necessarily have the capacity to make a major gift. And they're also very nervous about talking to major donors because it just feels very uncomfortable for them. I totally understand that. I think one of the ways that you can kind of make that process easier for them, if you do feel like your parents' board, Jennifer, has great stories to share, or sorry, that was Rebecca, and you want them to be out a little bit more visible in the community, is you could try pairing them up or pair them up with a staff member. I'm trying to think about who told me about this originally. It may have been my friend Claire Axelrad, but anyways, one of the things you can do is actually send them out in pairs. So rather than sending them out on their own to talk to people where they're feeling really nervous and they're not sure about what it's going to be like to meet with a donor or meet with somebody else in the community, is you can pair them up with somebody who's a more seasoned fundraiser at your organization. So if you have development officers who you know are going out to meet donors, have them take a board member along to get to know the process of what a meeting is like, or what it's like to just sit and talk to a donor for a while. That can really start to kind of break down their discomfort around that. They'll also feel more supported because they feel like they have somebody there who's more experienced, who understands the lay of the land. So if it gets awkward or they aren't sure what to do, they have somebody else there who can help them in that process. They can also just get comfortable with talking about their role on the parents' board or at your school, so talking about why they're passionate about that, why they like to be involved. And you can just keep reminding them it's all about just kind of having a conversation with somebody. That's their role in that meeting, is to just have a conversation and get to know somebody. And I found that can be a really great way just to kind of ease board members into the process of face-to-face meetings, getting them paired off and excited about just being a part of that. And again, kind of, I guess, lowering the barriers to entry where they don't feel like, the stakes are really high. They have somebody else there who can help them. Let's see what else. Oh, Michelle wants to know, what is Kay's last name? Yeah, it's Kay Sprinkle Grace. So I'm going to put this on the event page in the chat box for everyone. Sprinkle Grace. There we go. Okay, so it's in the chat box now, so you can take a look at that if you're interested. Yeah, Kay Sprinkle Grace is the woman who I mentioned. She does a lot of work around board member engagement and just getting board members more involved in everything. Yeah, so Beth wants to know, how do I organize stories so that you can collaborate effectively with your team? Really good question. There's a lot of things I've done over the years to collect and organize stories for organizations. A few things that I like to do that I think work really well, you can set up a private blog or Tumblr page that only your staff members and board members have access to. And so that's where you can post stories that you want them to share, maybe photos, videos, the actual written stories themselves. And that can just be a way for you to organize everything. You can categorize it by tags or categories, things like that, so that people can more quickly find stories about a specific program or type of experience, whatever that might be for your organization. That's one way to do it. The other thing you can also think about doing is, let's see, I use Google Forms a lot of times to collect stories. So we'll set up like an online form where people can actually submit their story. And that'll automatically get fed into a Google spreadsheet, which you can then share with other people internally so they have access to that. You know, if you don't want to do something that's quite so complicated, you could also just set up like a shared folder on your organization's hard drive so that everybody has access to that. I think those are a couple ideas I have around collecting and organizing. There's a few people who have told me things like Hatch, which is from the, oh, why am I blanking? It's an app created by the Rockefeller Foundation. There we go. For collecting stories has been really helpful for them just to organize it. I personally have not found a great kind of more, I guess, high-tech solution to it. There's a few things I do that I feel like are very low-tech. And maybe it's a problem I should work on solving. But one of the other things I use is Evernote or Microsoft OneNote, both of which are online. They're like cloud-based word processing programs. There we go. That's the word I was looking for. And so you can actually organize things in there by different notebooks or different chapters or sections in your notebook. And you can then share those notebooks with other people or share parts of that with other people. So that can be another easy way to start to kind of collect and organize everything and make it a little bit more publicly available or is it internally available to your organization. Yeah, so I hope that helps, Beth. Those are a couple things I've tried doing. Let's see, Danny wants to know if I have any thoughts on resources, prior experiences on blanket insurance for board members to eliminate their liability. That is a great question. I am not a lawyer, so I don't necessarily feel comfortable asking that or answering that for you. I can tell you, though, that it is important to have director's insurance because your board members are highly liable for lots of things with your organization. And it's also important that you inform them about their liability. As a part of the onboarding process, I think it's really important that they know exactly what they're liable for and what they're signing up for as a board member. So do make sure you talk to them about that. I'm sure that there's probably insurance professionals in your area who could also give you some better direction around that than I could. Barb shared something really great on the event page as well. She's asked her board to write up 3-sentence stories about how they got involved and wants to know what's a good way to follow up with them about that. Yeah, that's a really good question, Barb. So yeah, that's a good thing you could give board members. You could give them small assignments like writing up their stories or practicing telling stories in between your board meetings. One thing you could do to follow up with them if you want to just ask them a little bit more or kind of make sure they've actually done their homework is to bring it to your next board meeting and ask them or tell them, you know, we're going to share these and make sure it's done. And at your board meeting, you could scribble it down or you could record people if they feel comfortable. You could record them sharing their stories if you wanted to collect them for some reason. Or you could ask them to even just email them to you after the board meeting if you wanted to take a look at them and use those. Yeah, a couple other questions. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, Michelle. So I did mention Kay's last name. It's Sprinkle Grace. And if you scroll a little bit further down on the event page, you'll be able to see that there. Yeah, Kay's a great resource for all things board related. Let's see, other questions. Yeah, keep the questions coming, everyone. These are great. I'm really enjoying answering these for you. I know sometimes it can be a bit of a mystery working with boards. And as I was saying at the beginning of the Hangout, I actually think that one of the better things I did for myself was joining a board while I was a fundraiser. I was working as a development officer at the time at another organization in town, and I just wanted some more experience fundraising. I was working towards my CFRE, and I still am. And it was one of the things that I knew I needed to do was volunteer as a fundraiser for another organization. And it's just given me a lot of really interesting perspective around the conversation of board member engagement and board member involvement in fundraising. To actually be a part of a board, to see how it functions, to see some of the problems firsthand that come up, and to really explore a little bit more about why board members are so hesitant oftentimes to be engaged in fundraising. I think it'll just give you a little bit more perspective for your own organization and the board that you are dealing with in your professional kind of career setting. So I would highly recommend that. I do know, however, that sometimes there are things like conflicts of interest that organizations have. So if you are thinking about joining a board or interested in that sort of experience, maybe think about being involved in an organization that's totally different from yours, so that there's no overlap in missions or donors or things like that. I find that that's the only place where it can start to get tricky, of course, is when you're thinking about, volunteering for an organization that's very similar for as yours. So maybe just broaden the net, see what else is out there, see if there's other opportunities. A lot of times on local volunteer job boards, I know in Canada there's a website called govolunteer.ca that has lots of listings for board member positions. I'm sure there's probably something equivalent like that in the US. Probably something I should have looked up before we started. Yeah, that's just a really good resource, and I think experience for fundraisers to have is that opportunity to sit on a board and see what it's like, what some of the things that are coming up for board members are, and really being able to address a lot of those challenges a little bit more head on than you may have previously been able to. So let's see, a couple other questions. So another question here on our event page. With regards to fundraising efforts by the board of directors, would you elaborate on how an organization can ensure that board members maintain regulatory compliance, especially with regard to out-of-state contact and online venues? That's a good question. I would say that that's probably a question for your human resource department or legal counsel. That's probably something that you would want to include in your board member job description or kind of the MOU or letter of agreement that they're signing when they come onto your board. And if you are having them do a lot of face-to-face contact, chances are you probably want to have a good system in place for keeping track of what they're doing. So whether that's checking in with them once a month or checking in with them weekly about how their meetings are going, especially if your board's a little bit more active, that's something you probably want to have in place just to make sure that you kind of have a pulse as to where they are with things. And if they are potentially treading on any compliance issues, that would be a way to be able to address that with them. All right, other questions? I'm trying to think of other tips I can offer you all from other things we talked about earlier. Oh, I know, one really good resource for engaging people in personal narrative comes from Marshall Gans, who has done a lot of work around political storytelling. And I'll type this in the chat box for all of you as well. So Marshall Gans did work on the Obama campaign in 2008, and he developed something called Story of Self. And I'll just put this in the, there we go, on the event page so everyone has access to it. So he developed 3 types of story, like a storytelling model for the political campaign. There was story of us, so story of the group, story of now, so why the issue is urgent, and story of self, which is the story of why you, the person who's trying to get other people involved in something, believes that they should be involved in it. And he talks a lot about the idea of values and beliefs being a big part of how we engage and enroll other people in our issues, specifically around politics. But I think there's a lot of applicability of that in fundraising. I've personally been thinking a lot about this in the last couple months of what does story of self look like for fundraising professionals and also for board members. It is obviously slightly different than political work. But that's a really great resource. I think it's 350.org that has some guided questions on how to get people to develop their story of self. And I can try to find that, and I'll put it on the event page after we wrap up the Hangout today. So if you are interested in it, you can click over and take a look at some of those exercises. A lot of the questions are kind of about, why did I feel called to be a part of this? Why do I believe this is important? Things like that. What about this organization resonated with my values? How does it reflect my principles? Things like that, which I think are really important as a part of just the general storytelling narrative. I think that oftentimes what really connects people to our organizations is that alignment between personal beliefs, personal vision, personal values in the world. And the more that we can kind of take those things and kind of reflect them back to our donors to say, we have those same values, we have that same vision, we have those same beliefs, the more you can start to kind of form those very fundamental connections between donors and your organization. And so one way you can certainly do that is having your board members talk about some of those things in the stories that they tell or in their personal story as they're out in the community. Leo asked about the blog that I mentioned at the beginning of the Hangout. Yes, it's my friend and colleague, Claire Axelrad. She is a CFRE and JD. She is really quite brilliant. And she does a lot of work on major gifts and also board fundraising. So I will add her website into the event page on our Hangouts. There we go. So it's up there now if you all want to take a look at that. Claire has lots of great resources on her website for engaging board members in fundraising, lots of advice and tips on that. She was a development director for a number of years, certainly has a lot of great experience and perspective to be able to talk about how to engage board members a bit further on that front. So yeah, I hope that's helpful. Who else? Gail Perry also has lots of resources as well. I'll add her website into the Hangout page. Gail Perry does a lot of work on board member fundraising, and she also has a book on board member fundraising as well. I don't remember the name of it offhand. I'm sure it's on Amazon somewhere. So you can take a look at that if you want to find out a little bit more information. All right, so I see another question here on our Hangout page, which is great. So if any of you have more questions about getting board members involved, how to get them to tell those stories, please ask them. I'm happy to answer them for you. So let's see, this one is, in your experience, does a board member, does your board make the effort to get to know the organization's constituency as a way of fully appreciating the needs of the mission and to become better ambassadors? I'm not sure I fully understand that question. I do think it is important for board members to get to know the constituency and to get to know your donors a bit more. I think this is all just part of them being good leaders in general, because they need to be connected to everything that's happening at your organization on some level. They need to understand what types of people are giving to you, why they're giving to you, why people really care about that work. I think it is good for them to be engaged in that, because when they can see the types of people who are interested in the work, they're more likely to be able to identify those people who might be similar in values, beliefs, whatever demographics maybe, who are out in the community, or maybe people they know who are not yet connected to your organization, and they can then connect them to your organization by telling that story. I'm not sure that was a very clear answer. So maybe I'll try re-explaining that. But basically, the more familiar your board is with kind of the profile of the type of person who gives to your organization, the more likely they'll be to spot potential donors or potential contacts out in the community who might have similar values or beliefs. So yes, to answer the question that was on the Hangout page, it can be beneficial to acquaint your board of directors with who your constituency is so that they can be better ambassadors out in the community. Yeah, I hope that helps. Okay, any other questions? I hope this has been helpful so far. I know we've talked about a couple different things around storytelling and getting your board members involved with fundraising. As I said earlier on, I do think that the process of engaging them fully in fundraising, like if your end goal is to have them out the door making major gift asks, that is kind of I think a lofty goal, and it is one that I think there are several intermittent steps in order to get to. And one of them, I think, is getting them more comfortable with sharing stories, talking about their personal involvement in the organization. And so I think the more you can kind of do that with them now, the more you'll be able to help kind of usher them along that engagement ladder so that they will be at a place where they're able to then be comfortable, maybe making major gift asks, or maybe being a little bit more involved in fundraising than they currently are. So that's something to think about. Yeah, and I think like one thing that I often do with people when we talk about donor engagement, because they'll maybe say to me, you know, we want our donors to be more engaged, or maybe they have this goal of, you know, people getting to major gifts, or maybe legacy giving is kind of their highest engagement level, whatever that might be. What I think is really important to do is to kind of think about what is the engagement ladder or the steps on that path to getting to that final step of engagement. Because then you can kind of reverse engineer the relationship and figure out what you need to do to take somebody from point A to point B to point C, all the way down to where you want them to be at the end of that relationship. So in the example of making a legacy gift, you know, leaving a gift in their will. You can do the same thing with your board members. You can figure out how you want them to be engaged a year from now, 2 years from now, figure out what that looks like, really write some details down about what you want them to be doing, how you want them to be engaged with you, you know, what their work outside of board meetings looks like, and then figure out, you know, if that's like the ideal, if that's where you want them to be, what do you need to do now in the next 3 months, 6 months, 12 months to get them to that point? Do you need to update their job description? Do you need to provide them with training? Do you need to get them a little bit more experience, help them out in that department? Figure out what that is, because then you'll be able to more successfully take them along that path to the type of engagement that you're looking to have with them. Yeah, so Leo asked a really good question. Not sure if this has been addressed yet, but what do you do if a board member is simply not engaging, won't tell their story, for example, and thinks that fundraising is a bad word? Yeah, good question. I feel like there's so many good things I could say in response to that. Simone Joyeux wrote a wonderful book called How to Fire Lousy Board Members. I would highly recommend you check that out. Claire Axelrad has also told me about the importance of firing bad board members. Obviously, I think this is kind of one of those, not necessarily a last resort, but it is an important thing to think about. You know, you ultimately want people on your board who want to be there, who are willing to do the work that you need them to do, because they're volunteers and they're helping to build your organization's capacity in various ways. So if they are not engaging and you cannot find a good role for them in some other aspect of your organization, like helping out in some other way that would be really useful, like for instance, you know, if they're a CPA, being more involved in the audit process and a part of like your organization's audit committee when you go through taxes and things like that. That's certainly, you know, a specific and very useful role for a board member in that regard. But if you find that they're not engaging and you cannot find them another role that works for your organization as something you actually need them to do, it's probably a good opportunity to have a conversation with them about, you know, is this the right fit for you? And is it the right fit for us as an organization? You know, but that's a good time to engage your board chair and ask the board chair specifically, you know, to think about, you know, ultimately they're responsible along with the ED for managing the board, to think about, you know, do we have the right people on the board? Is it time to think about talking to people about what their plans are and if this is the right opportunity for them? I do recommend Simone Joyeux's book. It's a really great read. I think it provides you with a lot of excellent tools for thinking about, you know, what it looks like to have the conversation to get rid of a board member or to fire them. And I think she is very practical about the fact that, you know, board members are not just doing us a favor by being on the board. Like that's not, you know, the whole point of their job. They have to be useful. They have to be doing the job we're asking them to do. And so if they're not, you know, it's time for us to find other people who may be better suited to our organization's needs and to the board in general. So that's certainly something to think about. You know, it could start as simply as something with a conversation about just what the expectations are if they're meeting them. One of the things that I recommend doing is having an annual review of your board members and having your board chair and the ED do that together. Have them sit down, do a self-evaluation, talk about what their goals are, what they're currently doing on the board, and really get them engaged a little bit more in thinking about, you know, what their role is, if it's a good fit for them, and having that opportunity to make sure everyone's on the same page. That's certainly another helpful exercise that you can do with your board on an annual basis, just to touch base with everybody and see where they're at. I hope that helps, Leo. I know that's never a fun place to be when you have a board member who's not as responsive as you hope they would be. Okay, another question here. So we have about, just before I answer that, we have about 10 minutes left in our Hangout. We can always wrap up early if there are no more questions. But if you do have a question, you're welcome to send it in on the events page on the Google Plus Hangout for this event. You can just type it in the chat box and I will definitely answer it for you. So another question here, which is, wants to know if I have thoughts on sharing board stories on your website or on social media sites. Yeah, so I think this is actually a really good thing to do, or a good thing to think about. Nonprofit websites are notoriously unengaging, right? So I'm going to take a guess and say you probably have a web page somewhere on your website that has information about your board of directors, maybe their headshots, maybe their names and their titles, where they work, whatever. Things like that. And you maybe have a bio about them. Some organizations will, some will not. This would actually be a really good place if you've done an exercise with them to get them to tell their personal stories, to put their personal stories up on the website and talk about why they care about being on the board, why they're excited to be a part of this organization. And again, kind of bring that added element of humanity and I think personalness into your website copy. And by sharing those different perspectives and those different voices in that process. Yeah, so I think that's a really good idea. You know, one of the other things you could also do too is if you have a board member who has a particularly compelling story about why they're involved with your organization, that's certainly one you could think about using. You could have them be the signatory for an email appeal or even your direct mail appeal and ask them to share that story in a fundraising appeal if you felt like it was appropriate. Yeah, so lots of good ways that you can kind of engage them a little bit more in that. Okay, I think that was the last of the questions from our Hangout page. All right, so we'll go ahead and wrap up here. I hope this has been helpful for everyone. We've covered a lot of ground. So we talked about, you know, basic things we can do to get everybody on the same page. So making sure we have clear expectations with the job description, also providing you know, conversation for reframing what fundraising is, so helping board members understand it's not about just asking for money, that there's a lot of other parts and pieces to fundraising, and getting them interested in all those other pieces as well. I mentioned connecting them to your organization's story, also connecting them to their own story, and providing them with ongoing support. I think those are definitely the most important pieces of the puzzle. Yeah, so I hope this has all been helpful. There will be a recording of this up later if you want to go back and listen to it. A few of you have asked me where some of the websites are that I mentioned. So if you scroll down on the event page over on Google+, you'll be able to see that I put them in the chat box. This recording will also be up on YouTube later. I'll message everyone about that, and I will put the websites below in the description box on YouTube for you to take a look at. So thanks everyone so much for joining me for this month's Storytelling Nonprofit Google Hangout. This recording will also be up on my website, I think on Friday. And if you want to check that out, you can go to the storytellingnonprofit.com over to the blog, and I will also include a few more links to resources there. So be sure to circle back at the end of the week to check that out, and I will be sure to have this up as well as a few other resources for everyone. So thank you again so much for joining me today. We will be back again next month to do another edition of our lunchtime hangout. So if you have a topic or question on storytelling, do let me know. You can message me on Google+ or through my website over at thestorytellingnonprofit.com. This month's topic came from a reader's request, so I'd be happy to do that again next month. It's always great to cover things that are actually useful to other people. So let me know. I'm thinking next month we might talk about donor stewardship and stories, but if there's another request, we can definitely talk about something else as well. So in the meantime, I hope you all have a great rest of the week. It's Monday, so have a good one, and I'll see you all next month at our next lunchtime hangout. Have a great day, everyone.